You know what's strange? Every generation gets a stereotype. Boomers are called entitled, millennials are called sensitive, Gen Z gets treated like some psychological experiment happening in real time. But Generation X? Nobody even talks about them. The people born between 1965 and 1980 somehow became invisible. And maybe that's exactly how they learned to survive. Because Generation X grew up learning something dangerous at a very young age. Nobody was coming to help them. Not emotionally, not financially, not psychologically. And once that lesson gets wired into a child's brain early enough, it changes everything. It changes how you trust, how you love, how you work, how you react to authority, how you handle pain. Generation X didn't become emotionally distant by accident. They became that way because the world trained them to expect disappointment. And the weird part is, most of them still function better under pressure than almost anyone else. So today, we're talking about why Generation X trusts nobody, and why that mindset may have quietly shaped the modern world more than people realize. Part 1. The empty house. Picture this. It's 1978. You're 8 years old. The school bus drops you off in front of your house. You walk to the front door alone. You pull out a key hanging around your neck on a shoelace. You unlock the door and you walk into silence. No parents, no babysitter, no phone in your pocket, no way to contact anyone. Just an empty house. So you make your own food, do your homework, watch television, and wait. This wasn't rare. By the mid-1980s, millions of children were regularly unsupervised after school. Generation X became known as the Latchkey generation. But people underestimate what that actually does to a child psychologically, because when you repeatedly experience emotional isolation during your developmental years, your brain adapts. You stop expecting comfort. You stop assuming someone will rescue you. You start solving problems alone because that's the only option available. And eventually, self-reliance stops being a skill. It becomes your identity. That's why so many Gen X adults have this almost automatic resistance to asking for help, even when they're drowning, because somewhere deep in their nervous system is the belief that dependence is dangerous, that if you rely on people too much, eventually they disappoint you. And honestly, for many of them, experience proved that true. Part 2. The era of broken promises. Generation X grew up during a strange transition period. The older world was collapsing, but the modern world hadn't fully arrived yet. And everywhere they looked, institutions were failing. Divorce rates exploded throughout the 70s and 80s. Families that were supposed to stay together suddenly didn't. Parents preached loyalty and commitment, while their own marriages quietly disintegrated. Then there was work. Their fathers gave decades to companies that promised stability. And what happened? Layoffs, downsizing, pensions disappearing overnight. Generation X watched hard-working adults get discarded like expired equipment. That changes how you see the world. You stop believing loyalty guarantees safety. You stop trusting systems. You start assuming everything is temporary. Jobs, relationships, promises. Psychologists sometimes call this defensive pessimism, but to Generation X, it just felt realistic. Hope for the best, prepare for the worst, because the worst had a habit of showing up. That's why Generation X developed such a strong internal survival system. They became mentally prepared for disappointment before disappointment even arrived. Not because they enjoyed negativity, because psychologically, expecting less hurt less, and that emotional armor followed them into adulthood. Part 3. Why Generation X hides their emotions. Here's something younger generations often misunderstand about Generation X. Their emotional distance is usually not arrogance, it's protection. Gen X grew up in an era where vulnerability was treated like weakness, especially for boys. Nobody asked how you felt. Nobody talked about anxiety. Nobody explained emotional regulation. You handled your problems quietly, and if life hurt, you laughed it off.
This is where Generation X developed their famous sarcasm and ironic humor. People think it was just a cultural style, but psychologically, it functioned like armor. Humor became emotional camouflage. If everything is a joke, nobody can tell what actually hurts you. And this got reinforced constantly. Remember, these were kids growing up during the Cold War. Schools literally practiced nuclear attack drills. Teachers calmly explained how to hide under desks if bombs dropped from the sky. Imagine being a child and realizing adults are terrified too, but pretending everything is normal. That creates psychological contradiction. You learn to detach emotionally because reality itself feels unstable. And when instability becomes normal long enough, emotional distance starts feeling safe. That's why so many Gen X adults appear calm during chaos. Internally, many of them were trained for uncertainty since childhood. They learned to suppress panic, suppress vulnerability, suppress dependency. The problem is, suppression doesn't remove emotion, it just buries it deeper. Part 4. Why they don't trust authority. Generation X has a very specific relationship with authority. They respect competence, but they deeply distrust titles, because they spent their childhood watching authority figures fail publicly. Watergate, the Iran-Contra scandal, the AIDS crisis being handled with negligence, political corruption, economic instability. Again and again, the people in charge looked either dishonest or completely lost. So Generation X learned an important psychological lesson early. Authority does not automatically equal wisdom, and once that belief gets wired into you early enough, it never really leaves. That's why Gen X employees often seem skeptical in workplaces. Not rebellious, skeptical. If a manager knows what they're doing, Gen X will work harder than almost anyone else. But if leadership is incompetent, they mentally check out immediately because they don't trust confidence, they trust results. And honestly, that mindset made many of them incredibly sharp judges of character. They learned to observe quietly, watch behavior, ignore words, because words had failed them too many times already. Part 5. The internet changed everything. Here's what makes Generation X psychologically unique. They remember life before permanent visibility, before social media, before smartphones, before every mistake became digital evidence, and that matters more than people realize. When Generation X embarrassed themselves as teenagers, maybe a few people knew. Then life moved on. There was no permanent online identity, no algorithm tracking your behavior, no public performance attached to daily life. Privacy was normal, and because privacy was normal, authenticity felt safer. But then the internet arrived, and Generation X experienced one of the strangest psychological transitions in modern history. They went from analog childhoods to digital adulthood. They watched the world slowly turn into surveillance culture. Suddenly, everybody was broadcasting everything: meals, relationships, opinions, breakdowns. To younger generations, this feels normal. To many Generation Xers, it feels dangerous because they were raised believing the less people know about you, the safer you are. That's why so many Gen X adults lurk online instead of posting constantly. It's not because they don't understand technology. Half the people who built the modern internet were Gen X. They understand it too well, and that understanding makes them cautious. They know visibility comes with consequences. Once something becomes public, you lose control of it. That idea makes many Gen Xers deeply uncomfortable. Part 6. Their work ethic came from survival. Generation X doesn't romanticize work. In fact, many of them distrust corporations completely. But despite that, they developed one of the strongest work ethics of any generation. Why? Because responsibility arrived early. Paper routes before sunrise, working cash registers, bagging groceries, fixing things yourself before adulthood. These weren't hobbies, these were introductions to responsibility. And unlike today, mistakes had immediate consequences. If you forgot something, nobody rescued you. So Gen X developed competence, quiet competence, not performative productivity, not hustle culture speeches, just reliability, because reliability became survival. And after watching corporations betray their parents repeatedly, they stopped believing in job security. That's why many Gen X adults have multiple income streams, not because they're obsessed with entrepreneurship, because psychologically they expect instability. They assume every system eventually collapses, so they prepare, quietly, without talking about it. Part 7. The paradox of Gen X friendships.
Here's the strange contradiction at the center of Generation X psychology. They struggle asking for help, but they're often the first people to help others. Why? Because many Gen X friendships were formed through shared independence. When parents were absent, friends became emotional support systems, not through therapy language, not through endless emotional conversations, through presence, showing up, helping someone move, driving across town at midnight, fixing a problem without needing credit. That loyalty runs incredibly deep. But Gen X rarely advertises it. They don't post about being good people. They just quietly do the thing. And honestly, that's partly why younger generations misunderstand them. Generation X communicates care behaviorally, not verbally. They may never say, "I'm worried about you," but they'll show up at your door with jumper cables at 2 a.m. To them, actions matter more than emotional performance. Because growing up, they learned words were unreliable. Behavior was what counted. The truth is, Generation X may be the last generation that remembers what life felt like before constant connection, before algorithms, before permanent visibility, before every thought became content. They learned independence early, maybe too early, and that independence made them incredibly resilient. But it also taught them something dangerous, that trust is fragile, that systems fail, that people leave, that vulnerability can become a liability. So they adapted, quietly. They became the generation that keeps functioning no matter what happens. The coworkers who solve problems without asking for recognition. The parents who sacrifice without talking about it. The people who built modern systems while staying emotionally invisible inside them. Generation X didn't become guarded because they were emotionless. They became guarded because life trained them to expect instability. And maybe that's why they still feel different from everyone else. Not louder, not softer, just harder to reach. If this resonated with you, subscribe to Psyche Mode. And if there's another generation or psychological topic you want explored deeply, let me know in the comments, because human behavior gets a lot more interesting once you understand what shaped it.